The Charter of Rights was new in 1982, right? And that's when I started studying it and writing about it. And I watched what happened in the first couple of decades. And, after 2 decades, I wrote that book, The Charter Revolution and the Court Party.
Mm-hmm.
The Court Party basically is the legal judicial wing of the woke DEI movement. And they've captured the law schools. Well, they've captured the universities. They've definitely captured the law schools. And they captured the Supreme Court. And so, as I said earlier, they've turned the very idea of the purpose of a constitution inside out.
Concepts with Sean Buckley.
In this episode, we talk with Ted Morton. Ted is an academic and a former politician. In fact, he's one of the original members of the famous Calgary School of Political Thought. But he's the only academic to become a full-time politician, as far as I know. In our conversation, Ted talks about his transition from student days as a motorcycle-riding, anti-war activist to becoming a neoconservative professor of politics. Now, his academic career started right when the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms came into being, so he had direct experience with its development. We touch on national unity, provincial rights. Of course, he's from Alberta, but I happen to agree with him. But somewhat unexpectedly for a conservative, Morton actually highlights the importance of intellectual leadership in conservatism. Now, this is not something most conservative politicians promote, especially in Canada. It's very rare to get a look at politics through both windows of academia and retail politics. Ted has a ton of experience with both. I hope you enjoy this episode. Ted Morton is Vice President of Fairness, Alberta. He's a Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Calgary. In fact, he's one of the original Calgary School members. He was elected and served as an MLA to the Alberta Legislature from 2004 to 2012. He's a prize-winning author, having written and edited 5 books, and he's won a number of awards, including being one of Maclean's 20 most popular professors in 2001. Welcome, Ted.
Thank you for that very generous introduction.
Oh, my pleasure. So, Professor, I've been enjoying your book immensely, which is really weird because it's a political, well, it's an autobiography, Strong and Free, My Journey in Alberta Politics, but you've taken a bunch of political details and turned it into a thriller. So I hope people go out and buy this book. I just couldn't put it down.
Well, it's a bit Alberta-centric, but people are interested in conservative principles and ideas and the complexities of conservative politics. There are a lot of common themes.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so I wanted to start with you were quite the student radical, anti-war protester. And then on page 8, you say, quote, "By the time I left University of Toronto, I too was a neoconservative," end quote. Can you explain?
Well, I would back up a page or two before that. I was a typical 60s student, anti-war. I mean, I graduated from high school in 67, just when the Vietnam War was taking off. I had a couple friends that got drafted, one that got killed in the Tet Offensive in February of 1968. So I was very anti-war. In high school, I, of course, had never smoked pot, but I went off to university, and the next thing I know, there's all this pot around, so I start smoking pot. And so I'm, peace, love, and flower child. But I spent, after I finished university, and I didn't get drafted because I got a high number in the lottery system that year, I was a socialist. So I went, where does a socialist go? I went to Israel. I worked on a kibbutz. And the 8 months in Israel cured me of most of my 60s liberalism. On the kibbutz, I could see that 20% of the people did 80% of the work, and that Israel wouldn't even have existed without its Air Force and the U.S. Sixth Fleet right off the coast. So that was the beginning of my transition my mother said I went from being a left-winger to a right-winger without going through the middle. And she, as usual, she was often pretty close to accurate. But then Toronto, 4 years in Toronto, and studied with Alan Bloom and Walter Burns, who were quote unquote neocon refugees from Cornell at that time, teaching at the University of Toronto. Students of Leo Strauss, the University of Chicago, very influential in the conservative movement in the U.S. and Canada. So by the time I left U of T, in '78, I was a neocon.
Yeah. And so were you an East Coast Straussian or a West Coast Straussian?
I guess I'd have to be called an East Coast Straussian. I
Interesting.
I haven't I haven't I haven't been engaged in the fight,
Right.
but to the extent that I follow it and watch it, I think I have more sympathy with Harvey Mansfield than with
Yeah.
the crowd down at Claremont.
The Jaffa crowd. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's interesting because practically you've lived your life on the front lines and saying, no, politics needs to be a combat sport and get in there and make change. Whereas the Harvey Mansfield types on the, that's his name, right? Harvey Mansfield.
Harvey,
Yeah, I've
yeah.
got, yeah, Harvey on the East Coast are more academic and detached and, almost an elite crowd. And so I'm actually very surprised to hear you say that I'm an East Coast Straussian more. So.
I make a joke at the beginning of the book about uh, how does a professor become a politician, right? And I say some of my critics, some of my academic critics would have said I was always a politician. But um, part of my anti-war sentiment in the 1960s, my senior year of high school, I read a book about the Vietnam War,
Hmm.
and my first year of university, when there was a University of Freshman yearbook, or not a yearbook, but a freshman book of some sort, says where you're from, where your high school was, what your interests are, and what do you want to be when you graduate. What I wrote then was, I want to become a professor.
Wow.
That was when I was 18 years old. So I was interested in politics and interested in becoming a professor when, by the time I left high school in 1967.
Wow, impressive. I think when I was 18, I would have said I want a motorcycle or something like that. So,
Well, a couple years later, I got a motorcycle. Yeah.
oh no. Everybody in Alberta has to have a motorcycle, right? So I wanted to jump straight into some of the political stuff, and I apologize, we'll be jumping over huge sections, but and pulling quotes here and there. On page 40, you're talking about the PC party in Alberta, and you're talking about how it tended to be somewhat of a monolith in Alberta. And you say this quote, as I was soon to discover, at least a third of the MLAs, maybe half from the Edmonton area, would have joined the Liberals or even NDP in any other province, end quote. Explain.
Conservative Party started in the 1960s. Peter Lougheed in Alberta. Peter Lougheed, I think in the first election they elected two or three MLAs, but then they won a majority government in 1971, and the Conservatives formed government in Alberta from 1971 until 2015. So that 1971 to 2015. So it was a one party province for those years, and for people who wanted to get in politics, if you wanted to go to Edmonton and be in the legislature, with the exception of a few ridings in Edmonton and maybe one in Lethbridge, you pretty much had to be a PC candidate. So a lot of people who I think would have been liberals in any other province ended up running as PCs, particularly in Edmonton. And I think I list at 3 or 4 people who ended up leaving or getting kicked out of the PC caucus. They went over to the Liberal Party, and I think 2 of them became leaders of the Liberal Party. So I think the facts confirm that statement.
Oh yeah, for sure. And just for listeners, I mean, you give a couple of chapters talking about how you were campaigning and driving all across the province, and actually with people, a number of people that I know that I've come to know through Civitas. Fascinating material. However, it's so inside baseball that I'm not sure my audience will appreciate it as much as I appreciated it. So I want to try to stick to the bigger ideas, if that's okay. So I want to jump ahead to page 159, and you're talking about, I'll just read. It says, quote, the 2 conservative governments, Mulrooney, 84 to 93, and Harper, 2006 to 2015, simply took Western seats for granted. No party takes Ontario and its 121 seats for granted, end quote. And then on the next page, you say this, on page 160, quote, This attitude makes Quebec a reliable ally for Alberta in the politics of Canadian federalism. Governments often use the reference power to go to the courts to protect or to expand their jurisdiction, and then on and on. What what do people need to know about a conservative federal government not really supporting the Conservatives in Alberta?
Well, to form government, you have to have a majority of seats in the House of Commons. And to do that, you're going to have to win a lot of seats in Ontario or Quebec. And so, to Stephen's credit, not just once, but three times, Stephen Harper, he put together coalitions. First got him a minority government, and then a majority government from, I think it was 2006 or 7 to 2015. And so full credit to Stephen for that. Although, again, it was both he and then a decade and a half earlier, Mulroney, in a way could take the West for granted. And so that creates a problem. The other thing that you just mentioned, though, is potential Quebec-Alberta alliance. I don't know if people in Ontario have noticed this just in the last 2 weeks, but suddenly there's a dialogue going on between Premier Danielle Smith and the Premier of Quebec about a possible common front for trying to stop working together to block federal intrusions into areas of provincial jurisdiction. And there are several instances, several passages in the book where I point out that Lougheed worked closely with the leader of the PQ party back in 80-81, and we're getting the notwithstanding clause in the Charter of Rights, protecting provincial sovereignty that way. And then in my year and a half as finance minister, I worked very closely with my Quebec counterpart to challenge a federal initiative, ironically, of the Harper government that was going to create a federal securities regulator to replace all the provincial securities regulator. So Alberta and Quebec teamed up. We both brought challenges. We both intervened together in the Supreme Court, and we won. So there are precedents for Quebec-Alberta alliance on certain issues. And actually, I think that's sort of part of the Pierre Poilievre campaign now. We've had more than a decade, in some respects, 3 or 4 decades of Liberal Party government. Ottawa knows best, one size fits all. And I think there's a certain public sense that less Ottawa and more accountability in our provincial governments would be a step in the right direction. I certainly hope that's what people are going to be thinking in however many days are left in the election.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, and actually that jumps right to the very end of your book. In fact, almost one of the last, this the third last page, page 257, you said, you're talking about the Alberta Sovereignty Act, and then you say this, quote, recent academic commentary has supported the Sovereignty Act and suggests that it may be part of a broader, quote, new provincial rights movement, end quote. And so my question on that was, do provincial rights help the country stick together, or will that increase worry about separatism?
Yeah, I mean, neither path is risk-free. There's no guaranteed success, but I think certainly in Quebec, you can see that there's a lot of frustration still there, and evidently, unless things change, you could see a separatist government in Quebec again, I think in election next year. Certainly things in Alberta right now I'd say people are, or at least until 30 or 40 days ago, were very optimistic because Kenny got the two parties, ended the vote splitting that brought the NDP in. He got caught up in the COVID issues and stepped aside. Danielle Smith has come in, won a second election, basically building on and even expanding some of the work that Kenny did, which again ties back to the work that I was trying to do back in 2006. And then until 30 days ago, until Trudeau stepped aside and there was a Liberal leadership race, it looked like suddenly we're going to have a new Conservative prime minister who grew up in Alberta and spent a lot of time with people like me in the early days of the Reform Party, the 90s and early 2000s. Those were exciting, dynamic times. So, so I think that he certainly understands that the Ottawa knows best, one size fits all creates lots of dissension in country as large as Canada and diverse as Canada, and a regime of, call it provincial rights, or just a more decentralized form of federalism would take some issues that are very contentious at the federal level and take them back down to the provincial level, which could support national unity.
Yeah, great answer. So related to that issue, and I scribbled this in the margin, a lot of the arguments that you presented for provincial sovereignty I thought were great. You mentioned canceling Alberta's contract with RCMP, trying to get our own personal income tax collection, withdrawing from the CPP in the way that Quebec has done. And they're all economic arguments. I thought they were solid economic arguments. But I wonder whether you left this out, or to use a Straussian word, maybe this is the esoteric message in your theme here, where you say, the UCP, the United Conservative Party, has a ton of energy behind it. It seems to be very successful. And you almost give the impression that all that success is based on great economic arguments. But I couldn't help wondering, given the fact that Justin Trudeau is internationally known as a woke prime minister and a very socially progressive prime minister, I couldn't help wonder whether some of the things that you talked about earlier in your book about the rural aspects and the grassroots populist kind of sentiment, whether that wasn't firing the UCP in resistance to or disgust with Justin Trudeau's progressivism. But it doesn't seem that you really highlight that much at the end of your book.
I think that's a fair comment. The conservative voters in Alberta, the conservative movement in Alberta, like I think conservative movements on both sides of the border, have both libertarians and what might be called social conservatives or traditionalists. And historically, Alberta did have prior to the boom that came after the discovery of oil in 1948 and the dramatic growth of Alberta in the urbanization of Alberta in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It was very much a populist, what was then called those populist grassroots, progressive feeling. And so there's a strong sense of community and unity, social unity. As Alberta became more urban and as more people came into Alberta from outside, not just people coming to homestead and farm, but to come and work in the cities mainly and in the oil patch, the rural areas, it became more diverse. So both of those strands of conservatism are in Alberta. I think I certainly I'm both, if I can say, I have both libertarian and social conservative views. There's a chapter in my book, not a chapter, there's an appendix in the book called, what's it called? The Family is the Moral Foundation of Liberalism, something like that talks about simply protecting property rights and having division of power, separation of powers, that liberal democracy is more than just a political project and an economic project. It's also a social project, and it requires cohesion and sharedness, a sense of community. And that definitely is in Alberta. And certainly I think I benefit from it, and I think I contributed to it.
Yeah. So actually, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you about appendix number 2. You title it "The Family as the Moral Foundation of Freedom."
I'm glad I haven't forgotten the title.
The forgotten dimension of liberalism. And then on page 279, you have this quote, and it's fairly long, but it's really worth reading. Quote, "Liberal democracy is usually understood as only a political or economic project. a collection of equal rights-bearing individual citizens, or a collection of individuals rationally pursuing their economic self-interest in free markets. And I'll jump ahead a little bit. This view of liberal democracy is simply a political or an economic project is incomplete. Liberal democracy is also a social project. Just as democracy presupposes a certain political and economic infrastructure, so it requires a certain moral infrastructure. Most of the intellectual founders of modern liberalism recognize the need for citizens with republican character and the role of the natural family in producing public morality, end quote. How come we don't talk like that anymore?
Well, I think part of the resurgence of conservatism in Canada and the U.S. was a sense that the so-called people that call themselves progressives, they're not progressives. The progressives used to be the champions of the people, right? And now the new progressives, the DEI woke progressives, think the people are people like us, the people are the problem. That's why they try and they conduct their politics through unaccountable institutions like the courts, like the United Nations, like the bureaucracy. Okay, I digress a bit. Back to the question of that moral foundation. I guess it's not simple. It's simple to talk about private property. It's simple to talk about separation of powers and checks and balances, democratic elections, rule of law. That's all there. To talk about social cohesion, sometimes when I'm talking about it publicly, or I think even in teaching my classes, I'd say, you have free enterprise and private property. You have the institutions of the rule of law, separation of powers, democratic elections. But where's the social glue, the glue that keeps people together? And without that glue, those other things don't work. And that glue is a sense of community. And that is something that didn't he call himself a post-national?
Yeah, 2015, he was speaking with, I believe, the Wall Street Journal, and he said Canada is the first post-national state.
Yeah, in other words, all you have to do is have these institutions and free enterprise, and there's a lot of redistribution to take care. But it ignores the fact that for all of that to work, 99% of the people have to obey the laws 99% of the time, even when they know they could break the law and not get caught, right? No, because otherwise you need a police state. I mean, look at when all of that disappears and you have mob rule, which is going on in several states in Africa right now, and whoever has the biggest guns and the most soldiers and the best weapons, they set the rules.
Yeah. So related to that comment, and we're jumping around a bit in the questions that I wanted to ask you, but I think that connects with some of your work and thinking on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So your Appendix 3, you title it, "After 40 Years, the Charter is Still One of the Worst Bargains in Canadian History." I thought, boy, this guy doesn't hide what he thinks. And
That's the good advantage of retiring, both from politics and from teaching at the university. I don't have to pull my punches anymore.
Yeah, and I'm leaving out the most exciting bits of your book, so I encourage people to write it or to read it, to buy it and read it. But my question on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I'm glad you mentioned community. That's the basis of our stickiness. I wanted to ask you, what is the basis of our rights? So people talk about natural rights. People talk about rights being inherited. Let's say even David Hume said we have to have tradition and custom. That's all we can trust because we can't trust our reason. And then there's this sense that rights being arbitrarily made up and then interpreted by judges. So what is the basis of our rights? And the reason I ask the question is I'm worried that I hear so many conservatives saying, this is my right. I have my charter rights. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, certainly historically, natural rights, the rule of law, going back to Magna Carta, Runnymede, the evolution of first British government, and then coming over to North America on both the Canadian and U.S. side. All of that is premised on the idea of the primacy of individual freedom, and part of that individual freedom is property and the right to due process against government if governments are restraining you. So that's a very critical part, just as critical as the family, the moral foundations. What's happened, unfortunately, in Canada, but it's happened in the U.S. and in parts of Europe as well, that the new sort of woke left, the people that call themselves progressives, have basically reinvented the Charter of Rights. It's a bit complicated, but basically, I'd say Section 15 of the Charter, the equality rights section, sort of captures it most clearly. Historically, equality before the law, that laws couldn't discriminate between different groups of people unfairly, and that the laws had to be applied equally to everybody, regardless of race, religion, color, whatever. All of that was premised on the primacy of privacy and individual freedom and property rights, and was limiting government. The new left, the woke left, the DEI left, has replaced. They don't talk about equality anymore. They purposely have replaced equality with what they call equity. And equity means not an equal starting line, but equal results. Historically, equality, equal rights, everything I just said was about everyone starting at the same starting line. The new progressive left, they're not interested in that type of equality. They call it equity. They want everybody, regardless of that, at the finish line, to finish equally in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, everything else. One, it's impossible. It'll never happen. But two, it creates a huge administrative bureaucracy that they're in charge of, and that then they ostracize and even punish people who don't agree with them. And two, it leads to mediocrity. Part of the success of Canada, of the UK, of the US, of Western Europe is this system of liberal democracy and equality before the law and equal rights and all of that has created, I think I say this right at the end of the book, more prosperity, more security, more freedom, more happiness, particularly for women, than the rest of the world, not just the rest of the world historically, but still the rest of the world today. So, Canada's not perfect. The United States isn't perfect. There are issues, there are abuses of power, particularly towards Aboriginals, and of course in the States, the legacy of slavery, African slavery, that need to be addressed frankly and dealt with and continue to have to be dealt with. But don't throw away all the other institutions, principles, and traditions that have made us the freest, most prosperous places in the world. And again, there's a joke around that the only crowd bigger than the ones protesting outside U.S. embassies around the world are the crowds at the back door applying for visas to get here. And almost none of them are white. They're black, yellow, and brown. They see equality of opportunity. The traditional liberal values have created a much better society for everybody, regardless of race, color, religion, and they want to come here. So that's, again, the facts are on our side, I think.
Yeah, so it's a shift from the negative rights tradition to a positive rights. Where
they've turned the whole purpose of a constitution inside out. Instead of putting limits on government to facilitate society and the free market flourishing, they are interpreting the Charter of Rights now as requiring more government intervention to remake society according to this. They're kind of, the finishing line. Everybody crosses the finish line at the same time in the same proportions: race, gender, religion, ethnicity, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm. So something I've been struggling with, though, again, around rights is, we mentioned natural rights, and then immediately our support for rights is based on tradition, culture, Runnymede, Magna Carta, property rights, stable government. All these, they're all traditions, right? And they're all traditions that came out of a particular cultural approach, the Anglo or the British tradition, if you like. And that tradition is particular and it's contingent. And you might even say it's certainly not a propositional basis for, we write out proposition A, B, C, therefore you now have rights. No, these rights emerged over many hundreds of years of British common law and precedent, and things are tried. And go ahead, you want to?
And struggle and political conflict.
Yes, yes. And so now we look at this whole body as though it's a propositional a collection of propositions from which we can adjudicate. Well, therefore, now based on this, you get that right, and that person gets that right. And we've completely lost, at least since World War II, any desire to defend the tradition and culture and history and the whole mess that gave us these rights in the first place. So is it perhaps more accurate to say that this rights approach is somewhat of a freak of nature? It happened as almost an accident, a very fortunate accident after several hundred years of history. But we're going to have to actually articulate a defense of it, as opposed to saying, no, now it's kind of an American Constitution that we can just, find line and verse and say, this is why this right is good, and here's why that right's not good.
Well, written constitutions and judges play an important role in successful evolving democracies, but by themselves, democracy is a lot more than that. There's the political side, the economic side, what I said before, the moral side, the glue that holds everything together. So I think the conservative movement in recent decades has neglected that moral foundation of freedom that I write about in Appendix 2. But it's there, and it was discussed in the 18th and 19th century that some of the early founders and framers of liberal democracy talked very explicitly about that. We've sort of forgotten that. But then, so that's bad on us, so-called conservatives. But the left has first with the welfare state, which is now here, and I think I'm a supporter of the welfare state. I think we create a lot of wealth, and it's important to share it with people who need help. But the new progressive left, the so-called DEI left, the woke left, have gone way beyond that and basically say that everything we've inherited is basically just empowerment of white male chauvinist, colonialist power people, and it all has to be redone according to this new formula. And as I said, historically, the progressives campaign, the theme was power to the people. Today's progressives, the DEI, the woke group, for them, the people are the problem. And that's why you need to go into the courts. This is a lot of, actually going back to one of your earlier questions, my work on the Charter of Rights and how it was, because the Charter of Rights was new in 1982, right? And that's when I started studying it and writing about it. And I watched what happened in the first couple of decades. And after 2 decades, I wrote that book, The Charter Revolution and the Court Party. Mm-hmm. The Court Party basically is the legal judicial wing of the woke DEI movement. And they've captured the law schools. Well, they've captured the universities. They've definitely captured the law schools. And they captured the Supreme Court. And so, as I said earlier, they've turned the very idea of the purpose of a constitution inside out. Instead of putting restrictions on government to facilitate individual freedom and prosperity and success, they're interpreting the Constitution, and the role of judges is to interpret those rights to expand the scope of the state and supplant, if you like, and override legislatures that won't go in those policy directions.
Yeah, well said. So we got excited and jumped right to the appendices, which is where you get into the ideas. And I'm glad we did. But I wanted to back up a little bit, and because I want people to understand, one of the objectives of this podcast is to appreciate the varieties of conservatism across Canada and really to figure out a way to articulate it. And so one of the features with the Prairie style of conservatism is the antithesis that, or the antipathy, that's the right word, the antipathy you feel from the Laurentian elites. And so on page 12, you said, quote, in July 1st, I was endorsed by the Globe and Mail, and then blah, et cetera, et cetera. And then you say, quote, I had forgotten that in 2006, I had joked that the Globe's endorsement of Jim Dinning was a political kiss of death in Alberta, end quote. Explain.
Well, it was ironic because, again, this is when I ran for the leadership of the PC party in 2006. And I was at the beginning, the Calgary Herald made me a 500 to 1 odds of winning. And in the end, we came that close to winning, very, very close. And Jim Dinning was the overwhelming favorite, and he was endorsed by the Globe and Mail. So that's the kiss of death. So it was more than a little ironic. 5 years later, suddenly the Globe and Mail endorses me, and so I made that joke. Basically, my political involvement had a lot to do with the themes, the issues, the energy, the momentum that Preston Manning and the Reform Party started in the 80s and 90s. And you remember their theme, the motto was the West wants in, not out, the West wants in. And we want either, we're tired of being taken for granted. There's a famous quotation from the 1980 federal election. Pierre Elliott Trudeau's campaign manager said their strategy was screw the West, we'll take the rest, because they can form majority governments in Ottawa with just Quebec and Ontario together have 190 MPs. You only need 170 for a majority. So you have the resource-rich but voter-poor West and the voter-rich but resource-poor Central Canada, the rich in Canada. How do you win elections? Screw the West, we'll take the rest. So that was very much part of the origins, the birth of the Reform Party. It was my initial political involvement in politics. My first involvement, as I explained in one of the chapters of the book, is I ran for the Senate because, again, my American background, I knew that I came from a small Western state, an oil and gas state, and Western states were also resource rich but voter poor, and they articulated and defended their interest in the U.S. Senate. Each state has 2 senators. So I was a big supporter of Triple-E Senate reform. I ran, got elected. Maybe fortunately was never appointed. But anyhow, to remedy that constitutional and economic vulnerability of the West, we needed either more Western influence in Ottawa, i.e. Senate reform, maybe some other reform. But if we can't get that, then the alternative is less Ottawa in Alberta. In other words, more autonomy. And that's was the genesis of the so-called firewall letter, the reforms that I endorsed then, that I campaigned on. I was unsuccessful in my campaign in 2006, although I came pretty damn close. 41,000 people joined the Conservative Party of Alberta to vote for me. 99% of them were federal reformers. And basically, the Provincial Conservative Party said, no, we're not going to take you. So they went and formed their own party, the Wild Rose Party. Then we had vote splitting on the right, and that, of course, opened the door for the NDP. That's been put back together now, first thanks to Jason Kenney, now Danielle Smith. We have a United Conservative Party, and all of those reforms that I helped to articulate and then campaigned on in 2006 and 2011 that were considered a little bit radical or on the edge then are now pretty much mainstream in Alberta.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. The other thing, too, I wanted to get you to talk about, you have just beautiful stories about the 2-minute Tories, I think they were, and how that changed the election. Do you want to just explain what that is? And I don't think they exist anymore, right? They closed that loophole? Or?
Well, there was a ridiculous procedure for selecting leaders where there's nothing wrong with having your leaders selected by vote. But the PC party in Alberta had 2 rounds of voting, and the top 3 finishers from the first round went to the second round, and there was no cutoff date for buying memberships either before the first round or the second round. So repeatedly, again in 2006 and again in 2011, when it was clear that whoever won the PC leadership would immediately become premier of the province, lots of Liberals and NDPs went out and bought PC memberships, the two-minute Tories, that you could buy them at the door. You walk in, you voted for the least conservative, the most liberal candidate. So it was a way for non-conservatives to, if the Liberals and the NDs couldn't win a majority government in Alberta, they could at least influence the leadership of the PC party by electing the least conservative potential leader. So Denning and I got crushed by that in 2006. We ended up with Ed Stelmach, and then in 2011, the same thing.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So I couldn't help thinking. I think Strauss talks about the unresolvable tension between theory and practice, and I kept thinking to myself, okay, here's a professor steeped in theory, and yet he's living the grittiness of political practice and all these machinations. And I thought that was fascinating. I wanted to ask you about power. So page 239, you talk about the dynasty syndrome. Power replaces principles. And on page 240, there's a couple of beautiful sentences. You say, quote, politely, these types of politicians can be described as pragmatists, so the ones who get into power. Less politely, as opportunists, or worse. For them, policy is a means to power. You say what you need to say to win the election. At the other end of the spectrum are what might be called principled politicians, or, less politely, ideologues. For this type, power is the means to influence policy. The purpose of engaging in politics is to influence public policy. You say or do what you think is quote unquote right, even if it costs you votes. End quote. That's pretty cynical, sir.
Oh, I think it's quite accurate. I mean, those are the two extremes. The pragmatist or opportunist, who the main thing is just to win power and form government, and the other end of the spectrum is the person for whom certain issues are the most important issues, and even if it means that you can't form a winning majority coalition, that's okay. If it involves vote splitting and not winning, that's okay, because you're standing up for what's right. And I think I go on to say, at different times and in different circumstances, successful parties need a balance of both. Certainly, my critics would have said in the early 2000s that I was an ideologue. I was from the PC Alberta PC party point of view, I was too principled. I was an ideologue, and I was not paying attention to building the broad party base. And fair enough. But as you asked me about a quotation earlier from the book about all the people, particularly from Edmonton, who were in the PC caucus, that in other provinces would have almost certainly have run as Liberals or NDP. So for them, getting in was simply priority. At different times for different parties, you need a combination of both.
Yeah, no, and I apologize to tease you with that. It's just, I thought that paragraph was perfect because in my limited experience just in medical politics, politics it always involves some level of compromise.
Absolutely. Because there are no natural majorities. To win a majority government, either provincially or federally, you have to knit together a complicated, broad coalition of different interests, regional interest, economic interest, ethnic, religious interest, all of it. And particularly, Canada's huge, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the 49th parallel to the Arctic Circle. I mean, putting together, but that's what democratic politics requires, is building that coalition. And so a party that's all made up of pragmatists, i.e. opportunist, or I can say something worse, who wants them, right? But on the other hand, if you have too many principled people, if the principled or the ideologues don't pay attention to the need of building that coalition to form government, you never form it. So that's part of the challenge of democratic politics.
Yeah, and I found it a challenge just as an individual. Okay, you're always asking yourself, where is your line? Where is your limit? And can I log roll on this issue because I really, really care about this other issue?
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
so at Preston Manning, I just talked with him yesterday. I'll put his episode up soon, but he said there was a conservative conference in Canada, and they asked representatives from east to west, what is the essence of conservatism in Canada? And I wanted to get your thoughts on this. He said the Atlantic guy said tradition, and the Quebec guy said soft nationalism. The Ontario representative said no, business. The Alberta guy or the Prairie's representative said, no, it's revolution. And then the guy from BC said, no, it's polarization and being at the right end of the pole. And neither myself nor Preston were sure what that meant. But what are your thoughts on that? I mean, if we can't even agree on the right of center from coast to coast, uh, how are we going to get anything done?
I go back to the conversation we just had, that how do you, in a nation as large and diverse, both geographically and in terms of citizenry, building a party that can win majority governments, it requires a fabric with many strands in it, and it has to be able to accommodate the aspirations. You have to figure out what are the commonalities between Atlantic Canadian conservatism, Quebec conservatism, Quebec nationalism, if you like, Ontario business. What was the Prairie? What was their
Revolution.
I thought they'd say cows, wheat, and oil. There's pretty strong economic interest in central in the West, and then BC. I'll let somebody else just describe BC. But
Yeah.
it's a challenge. But that's why we need leaders. That's why we need leaders to knit together that fabric that can pull such a large, diverse country, and just one part of it, people who have enough of them to form a government, and that's the challenge that face all parties,
Yeah.
not just the Conservative Party.
Right. And part of solving that challenge, I think, is right on the last page of your book. And I was really happy that you put this here. You said, talking about Alberta sovereignty and how this is a new thing. You said, quote, the Alberta sovereignty movement now has what Quebec has had for the past 40 years. And then this sentence is what I wanted to ask you about. Quote, this type of intellectual leadership, while new to Alberta, is an important dimension of politics in all modern democracies, end quote. So I think that we don't have enough work being done on articulating not only the diversity in conservative thought from coast to coast, but even taking this passion. Preston is very articulate on populism as a Western phenomenon and how really it hasn't been studied much in the universities or fleshed out, other than to say these people are wild and crazy and you never know what you're going to get. So, but I think we're missing something if we can't. I use this quote all the time from Roger Scruton. He said, conservative intellectuals are people who find reasons for people who don't need reasons. So most people know right? They know what they love. They know what they think. So when you call for an intellectual leadership, is that the sort of thing you're thinking of, or were you thinking of something else?
No, I think the example that comes to mind is I was part of the so-called Calgary School, right? That Stephen Harper, I guess, wasn't part of, but was certainly a graduate of the Calgary School, as was Daniel Smith and Pierre and others. A lot of the Calgary School, and we were different. We're a couple of political theorists, a couple of historians, Reiner Knopf and I studying the courts. And so we gave an intellectual, there's always been, you go back to what you said before, what's what's Prairie conservatism? And someone said revolution. Yeah, well, there's always been that populist anger in the West, right? Again, look at the book. The very first cartoon in the book shows the milk cow, right? The Western cow, the farmers in the West feeding the cow, and the bankers in Ontario and Quebec milking the cow. That's Western conservatism. But it was pretty easy for people in Ontario and Quebec to dismiss that as just a bunch of, like you said, just a bunch of crazy farmers, right? I think part of what the group of people that I was part of did, Flanagan, Cooper, Knopf, myself, Berkeson, that, and more recently Jack Mintz, we brought intellectual credibility and intellectual weight to those grievances and articulated them in a way that I think helped build the movement. What was your quote? We were finding reasons for people that didn't need reasons, but they liked now that somebody else came up with them, they liked it. Yeah. So again, if you look at that sentence, I think there's a footnote in it to a colleague of ours who studied with us at the University of Calgary, University of Toronto, John Ure. He teaches at ANU, Australian National University over in Australia. And he's written quite a bit about that, the influence of kind of academic policy scholarship on the development of politics.
I apologize, I don't have that quote, but I will, or that reference, but I'll definitely look it up. Yeah, no, so thanks to you guys, we actually have a body of work. I think there's more work to be done, but certainly you guys have pointed the way. In the last minute or so, I always have to apologize to the guests because I've gotten to direct where I want to go, what I'm interested in. What do you think we should be interested in as Canadians? What keeps you awake at night? Or maybe nothing keeps you awake anymore because you don't have to worry about this, but what should we be asking or worrying about?
Well, we're talking on, April 10th in the midst of this Trump craziness that's gone on for the last couple of months. And obviously, in one sense, it's a crisis for Canada. Economically, it could hurt us a lot. But potentially, the crises often have a positive side. It reminds us why we don't want to be the 51st state and why we're proud to be Canadian and why we want to keep Canada together. So, maybe that something positive will come. The economic risks are there and we don't know how bad they're going to be. But it's been a reminder that we can't just take for granted Canada. And so it may help on a national unity stage, certainly in the discussion of energy infrastructure in the future. Now, all of a sudden, the new leader of the Liberal Party is talking about energy infrastructure and all of that. So maybe something positive will come in that respect. But I would go back to our earlier conversation. I think since Pierre Elliott Trudeau, so 1968, we've had a series of governments, the exception being Harper, that pretty much accepted and expanded the idea that Ottawa knows best, one size fits all, and that centralizing, growing the federal government and using funding and putting conditions on funding to get into areas of healthcare, provincial jurisdiction, or even in my area of specialization, the Charter of Rights, the use of interest, the funding of interest groups to challenge provincial laws, the court challenges program. That one size fits all, Ottawa knows best. I think people are tired of it. And I think going forward, I'm hoping that whether it's under Pierre or whoever is leading the Conservative Party, and I hope a Conservative government will explore the possibility of lessening conflict with Ottawa by letting provinces do more. I'd end by saying that.
Yeah, brilliant. That's where my passion lies too. Certainly, federal spending power just gives me hives when I think about it. But thank you so much, Professor Morton. This has been fantastic. I would encourage people to go out and buy your book. And if you've made it this, no, seriously, this I really enjoyed it.
It's a bit Alberta centric, but if you're interested in national politics and national conservative politics, there's a lot there that you'll recognize.
You can't understand Canadian politics by ignoring Alberta. And this is a case in point. Don't ignore this.
Thank you.
Yeah. If you've made it this far in the podcast, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks again, Ted.
You're welcome. Thank you.